We have achieved great things. We have made giant leaps. We've gone far beyond what we thought was possible. But we have only just begun. Our future in space is unlimited, and it will benefit all humanity. But it will take hard work, new technologies, advanced financing models, and enabling public policy. The Beyond Earth Institute is creating a policy and legal framework to enable the creation of economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. We will engage all stakeholders on critical policy issues: property rights in space, norms of behavior, conflict resolution protocols, filling the technology gaps, exploring new financing mechanisms, and making space settlement an agreed goal of the U.S. and its allies. Beyond Earth is committed to the true purpose of why we go to space. Join us on this journey.
And welcome everyone to another great webinar put on by the Beyond Earth Institute. I'm Steve Wolf. I'm the president of the Beyond Earth Institute, and I couldn't be happier to introduce this fabulous program where we look at the commercial space market forecasts. What's really exciting about space right now is that all of the financial institutions, the traditional ones, are paying more attention to the space economy than ever before. We know that this is a burgeoning sector that's going to have a tremendous impact on the global economy. And that's really exciting because if I can ask folks to keep yourselves on mute, this is going to provide the underpinning for a tremendous human expansion into space ultimately. And that's where Beyond Earth is what Beyond Earth is all about. Before we get into this program and I introduce our moderator, I would like to share just a few things going on with the Beyond Earth Institute that I'd like you to know about. So if we could share those slides right now. We have just launched our new policy review, which is available on our website. All of these items, all this information is on our website at beyondearth.org. Policy review, excellent articles. We're looking to publish this twice a year to be an important mouthpiece for a range of issues that we feel are important to building this future space economy. Next slide. And our Beyond Earth Leadership Council is very much underway. We have a leadership council membership. You could see there on the left, that's building and growing. We have working groups, 5 working groups that are underway. Those of you who are interested in these particular types of issues and would like to get involved, please do get in touch with me. I'd love to hear from you. Next slide. We have just kicked off the Beyond Earth Business Challenge, which is a business plan competition that will run through the fall. This is meant for companies of different shapes and sizes that are in one way or another involved in human space transportation and habitation. So again, full information is on the website. Encourage you, if you're an entrepreneur in this sector, encourage you to take a look and get involved. Next slide. And of course, we're looking forward to the Beyond Earth Symposium, the 2024 edition, with the title At the Crossroads, Committing to a Permanent Future for Humanity in Space. And it's really shaping up very well. Some of our speakers include, next slide. We're fortunate to have Scott Pace, Kevin O'Connell, who's on our call today, actually will be with us, Michelle Hanlon, and Lori Garver. And Lori, of course, is the former deputy administrator for NASA. And I've known her for over 40 years. So very excited about that. And of course, we're very excited that we have Ron Moore, who's a creator and executive producer of For All Mankind. Anyone who's a fan of this show will want to be there to meet him personally and hear what he thinks about the future of space, what the future of space holds. And then finally, we want to get to our program. As I mentioned, recognizing that space is an emerging sector, and with and looking at those projections as we will today, uh, where the industry or the financial sector is recognizing that we should be paying attention. How do we measure this? What are the credible numbers? There's a range of different projections out there, and so and Courtney Stad, our executive vice president, when he came up with this idea, I said this is a perfect discussion to have. And he has brought together an incredible panel. So I think without any further and you can take the slides off. Without any further discussion, I just want to introduce. I want to hand this over to Courtney Stad, a Beyond Earth Executive Vice President, to introduce the panel and get the program underway. Courtney, program's yours.
Thank you, Steve, and indeed, welcome to this webinar's topic, commercial space forecasts. Are they credible? Who to believe? Space market forecasting, especially in the nascent commercial space domain, leads to all sorts of skepticism and arguably even misunderstanding at times as to how to view the credibility of these forecasts, let alone how best to use them for planning purposes. Some of us are old enough to recall back in the 1980s, forecasts for a multi-billion-dollar commercial space materials processing industry that proved so unrealistic that it became notorious in the space industry for what one might charitably call magical thinking. But in recent years, we've witnessed a wave of forecasts from large banks, business think tanks, the Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, marquee business consulting institutions such as McKinsey and Company, regarding what the space economy might look like within the next 20 to 30 years. The forecasts range anywhere from 1.1 trillion to 2.7 trillion. Former Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross gave a speech 4 years ago at the World Economic Forum that predicted $1 trillion before 2030, just 6 years from now, and upwards of 3 trillion by 2040. And by the way, if you think these numbers are big, one Chinese official was quoted as predicting $10 trillion by 2050. And one of our own panelists is predicting numbers that are rosy as well, although not quite close to this Chinese official's prediction. So how to make sense of all this? We brought together truly an impressive group of subject experts who dwell in the world of economic space data on a daily basis, and whose various jobs call for turning this data into space information products that inform our space community at large, businesses, federal and state officials, media, and Wall Street analysts. And by the end of the webinar, I'm hoping we'll provide more insight into issues such as what are the assumptions and definitions behind these macro space forecasts? How should the public view these forecasts? Why are they important? And in the case of the government, how does the Bureau of Economic Data approach the difference between forecast and government statistics? And how is BA intending to improve its analyses in the future years? And the space report put out by the Space Foundation, how does it compile its annual global space economy data? And what are the challenges, and how is the space report approaching improving its analysis in future years? And what are the possible black swans that are looming out there, either in a negative or positive way in terms of the future trends of the commercial space economy? So let's turn to our experts. And if you allow me, let me avoid using up precious time on their bios. You can find the details of their incredible biographical credentials online. We're joined by Dr. Tina Highfill, Senior Research Economist, Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis, and a real pathfinder in helping establish their space economy focus. George Pullen, who's Chief Economist, Milky Way Economy. Leslie Cohn, Director of Research and Digital Programming, Space Foundation, and overseer of the Space Report, whose numbers on the global space economy are eagerly awaited, widely cited. Kevin O'Connell, founder and CEO of Space Economy Rising, and former head of the Office of Space Commerce. And finally, Chris Quilty, well known throughout the community
Sorry, I'm in a
He's a
telecom right now.
co-CEO and president of Quilty Space. And by the way, has a must-read section often in the space report. So I apologize rather than going individually. I wanted to get everybody out, and we'll follow after Dr. Highfill. We'll follow in the sequence I mentioned. So after Dr. Highfill, George, Leslie, Kevin, and then finally Chris. So starting with Tina Highfill, I'd like all of you to spend just a couple of minutes introducing yourself, quick take on how you approach these forecasts, or in the case of Dr. Highfill, Tina, the role of the BEA and space economy related statistics. And then I'll start with a question to prompt discussion. And meanwhile, you in the audience are urged to populate the chat room with your comments and questions, and I'll do my best to intersperse your inputs throughout the conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Tina Highfill.
Thank you so much, Courtney. It's great to be here. So I'm a research economist at the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And if you're not familiar with BEA, we produce many of the official macroeconomic statistics for the United States. We don't produce forecasts, but forecasts and statistics typically go hand in hand because statistics often inform the predictions used in forecasts. And so I'm excited to talk a little bit about the BEA statistics that we just released a couple of days ago for data for 2017 through 2022. We'll get in the details later, but just as a general overview, what these space statistics are, as I mentioned, the BEA, we produce statistics on the overall economy. And so these space statistics are drilling down on just the space economy within the overall US economy, meaning we use the same foundations and same data that we use to measure the overall economy to measure the space economy. Definitions that we use were based on extensive research and contact with subject matter experts, including a lot of the people on this panel today. And so what we think of a space product is something that's used in space or supports a product in space. So that would be like a satellite, but also insurance, spaceports, software, goods and services that use space input to function. So this would be things like PNT equipment or satellite telecommunications. And then the third criteria is goods and services related to studying space. So this is like R&D and educational services. And so what our data show is that in 2022, the US space economy contributed 132 billion to US GDP, which is about 0.5 percentage point. And that may not sound like a lot, but that's it's big when you compare it to other sectors. So the entire agricultural sector in the United States is 1% of the economy. So 0.5 percent is actually a lot bigger than it sounds. So I will just stop there, and I look forward to talking about this more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tina. And before moving to George, Tina, if I could impose, if you don't mind, in the chat room, putting the link to your particular website, that'd be wonderful. I appreciate that.
Okay.
And I encourage all the other panelists to do the same, links to areas that you think would be pertinent. So with that, let me shift to George Pullen.
Well, Courtney, I appreciate the invitation here. I'm really excited to be a part of this. So a little bit about me and about Milky Way Economy. So Milky Way Economy is a fifth industrial revolution think tank. We focus on answering the types of questions that ChatGPT will not tell you because there's not enough data for it to learn the answer. With that out of the way, we also have our own family offices that do invest some money into deep tech and space. And then thirdly, myself and a number of the other partners also teach. I have a teaching appointment with Columbia, where I've been teaching space economics in the summers for the past 6 years. And I also teach blockchain, deep tech, and space for University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce Law School, #1 IP trademark school in the country. So that's me in a nutshell. This is me in a nutshell. Let's see what else. I was a banker for 10 years. I was a federal servant for over a decade. And I've been a space cadet for at least 6.
And a Marine Corps veteran, I might add.
Hoorah.
Next is Leslie.
Good morning, and thank you, Courtney. Thank you to Beyond Earth Institute for giving me this chance. So I'm with the Space Foundation, which I hope most people know, in addition to the worldwide education programs that we conduct, in April, we will have the 40th anniversary of the Space Symposium, which is also a Space Foundation undertaking. That was really the initial growth of recognizing not only the growing space community, but the economic power that it holds. So in 2006, the Space Foundation started the Space Report. We are now working under a quarterly publication schedule, but we also have a digital presence for those who need information always. And as you've mentioned, we are in the final stages of looking at our analysis that will examine the growth from 2022 to 23 of the global space economy. So we do take a worldwide look at that. We will, in this edition, also look ahead to what indicators we have for 2024 and beyond. But really the bulk of the digging in that we're doing really looks back at actual budget spending, not projected spending, and then commercial revenues as an outgrowth of that.
Thank you. And Kevin.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Steve, Courtney, thanks for the invite to be with you today. Today, I run an advisory firm called Space Economy Rising, where we do strategy, finance, and regulatory advice for quite a few companies. So not really in the forecasting business these days, other than to help companies sharpen their pencils on their own projections of the future for investors. This is a long-standing issue for me. You know, when I went into commerce in 2018, I had a set of 4 initiatives that I wanted to pursue. One of which was improving the quality of space statistics, you know, that I had seen over the years. I remember going back 30 years, the TAM for remote sensing seemed to be, you know, an interesting number, and it seemed to never change over the next 3 decades. And so, you know, on the one hand, this is genuinely hard. You know, when you look at your cell phone, you realize that half the things that are on there could be linked to space, and it's just difficult to analyze the value. On the other hand, when we think about being able to count launches and satellites, that's relatively simple compared to economic productivity, the value of scientific knowledge, and things like that. So I think we're just getting started. Again, Tina's work at BEA has been fantastic. There are others around the world that are starting to pay attention to the rigor of these data. And they're really important signals to both government officials as well as investors and even entrepreneurs, not just in space entrepreneurs, but also in adjacent spaces. As the space economy moves forward. So, Courtney, I'm looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Thanks. And least but wonderful of all is Chris, in your perspective. So thank you. Oh, Chris, you're on mute.
You.
Yeah, I think I can hear you now.
There we go.
Yeah,
Is it working?
perfect. Yep.
Perfect. Yeah, this is the first time I've done this, so thanks for the help. So Chris Quilty of Quilty Space. I am a financial analyst. I've been writing financial research on the space industry for 25 years. Spent 20 years at Raymond James as, you know, what we in the industry call a sell side analyst. So I was the guy doing the buy sell ratings on stocks. Left Raymond James in 2016 to start Quilty Space. A group of about 10 people, and we do 2 things. We do research on the space industry, and it's both, you know, the company level research on individual companies and their finances, as well as macro research. On the other side of the business, we also do investment banking transactions. So think of advising companies on mergers and acquisitions and raising capital. And, you know, I would just note, since no one has mentioned it here up to this point, we should probably, as we're talking about the future and predictions and whatnot, refer back to the great God King philosopher Yogi Berra, who said, it's really difficult making predictions, especially about the future. And as a guy who couldn't even call a quarter ahead correctly on what a company would do, gives you a sense when you're trying to do those 5, 10, and 20-year forecasts, it's tough business. So give us a break. It's not easy, but then we're all friends, so we can throw some sticks and stones also.
That's great. That's a great point to end on and help actually set the tone. So why don't we start with what those of us who've at the very minimum have had economics 101 or statistics and so forth is get into the forecasting, the methodology, the assumptions, definitions. I could probably call on any one of you, but let me start with you, George. When it comes to forecasting,
Yeah.
how do you, if you could help the audience sort of unpack
The process. Sure.
right?
So when an economist, statistician, analyst, overpaid consultant goes out to make a forecast, that was a joke, people can laugh, goes out to make a forecast, they're going to start with data and they're going to start with assumptions. And this is why within the industry, we're all friends, but we all throw sticks and stones at each other, because the data that I'm using is probably similar to the data that you're using, but we're just going to apply different assumptions to that, right? One of the things that oftentimes happens with forecasts is you'll get a range forecast. Now, the reason we give range forecasts is because, like my friend Chris said, it's very hard to be accurate the further out you get, right? I'm not sure what I'm going to have for dinner tonight. I have no idea what's going to happen in 10 years, okay? So these are everyone's best guess based on the data that we have available to us. The next part of this is, what is the purpose of the forecast? Now, some people say the purpose of the forecast is to get my VCs excited because, hey, I'm raising my next series. Okay, great. That serves a purpose. But the other purpose of the forecast, and especially when it's iterative with the company, is everything else it reveals, right? When we go through what are your assumptions, that talks to what your business is going to specialize in. That talks to what you believe your roadmap is for your technology, right? How many of these partners will be based out of the Pentagon? How many of these partners are going to come from commercial? All of these assumptions matter. And so it's what the forecast reveals as you make it that is equally as important to the golden number, because I will tell you, frankly, no one has that golden number. The next thing is, in definitions anyway, we'll get wrapped around with each other a little bit, where we talk about the difference, Econ 101 style, between what an industry is and what an economy is, okay? So when we talk about the space industry, we're talking about all the firms that are contributing to space activity, okay? So these are clearly identified. Now, when I say clearly identified, they don't technically have GICS codes. I'm sure that could be a little side debate, but GIS is basically a global industry classification standard, GICS. And for space, we don't have one. Okay. So if you're in the market for making cell phones, you have a code. If you're in the market for space, you do not. Okay. So again, these are the industry codes. When we talk about economy, however, we're talking about something bigger than an industry, because an economy is not just all the firms participating, but it's also all of the additional economic activity that they're generating and all the generation of that activity on secondary and tertiary effects. Okay. So again, space industry, space economy, and these definitions matter. And sometimes that's why there's such differences in the numbers. The third thing, just to level set, and I'll keep it brief. The third thing, just to level set, is the difference between a forecast as it relates to just the US or a forecast as it relates to global activities, right? I don't know what percentage of this audience is US based versus overseas, perhaps, but it's important to keep in mind that while the US does spend a lot, and in fact, the majority on space, there are several other nations out there also spending on space, also generating their own space industries with their own space ambitions. And so sometimes the numbers also seem different because they're not necessarily taking into account what's going on in other countries. So those are my three things.
Thank you, George. Anybody else want to add to that, Chris, or anybody else?
Well, I was just going to say, you didn't have to tell us to laugh, George, because we're always laughing at you. But yeah, I mean, I think definitions are an issue, and Tina and their crew, I mean, it's important. It seems like boring work, but we wrote a report on space situational awareness, right? So these are companies building sensors that go out into, the LEO and GEO orbit to look at stuff. And the first place we had to start was a definition, right, of what these markets are. And if you you can change the definition or the terminology. Like, is it SDA? Is it SSA? And you have to go through all these fights. And, I'd say one of the problems that we have in our industry is everybody has their own definition. So what is a small sat? NASA has a different definition than does, number of different market research firms. So we had to kind of create our own internal definitions for all this stuff. And that's important, right? I mean, it's important at the base level because you can't come up predictions if nobody can determine what stuff is. The easy stuff is what's historical, right? You can count up the number of satellite antennas or the number of satellites that were launched or the number of launches that happened. But even that stuff isn't direct. So give you an example. It used to be, prior to Starlink, the number one thing people focused on is geo-satellite orders, right? And there's only 20 to 25 a year. It's not that hard to count them, right? But the difference is, when Lockheed used to sell satellites to Chinese companies because the Chinese didn't have their own satellite manufacturing industry, we called that a commercial sale. Well, now when Chinese satellites only buy from Great Wall China, is that a commercial sale or is it non-commercial? Wait a second, it's the same customer. He's still buying a satellite, but we're making a opinion decision that turned at one point from being commercial to non-commercial. So, reading all the footnotes and stuff that Tina and her crew will end up publishing around definitions and whatnot is really, really important stuff. And, again, it's in the weeds, but it does matter. And, definitions, like I'm all for what BEA is doing. Make us an industry, please. We don't want to be 0.5%. We want to be 2%. My life, I was a satellite analyst, and I make a joke. I used to be a small cap defense analyst in the late 90s and early 2000s. Guess what happened to every single small cap defense company post 9/11? They got acquired. So I said to the boss, to stay gainfully employed, how about I cover these space companies? They look kind of interesting. I was too stupid to realize there was a reason that nobody was writing research on space companies in the 2000s, but whatever, I stuck with it. But my problem was at Raymond James, my job was to get paid, to make money for Raymond James, was to get investors interested in my stocks. So if I pick up the phone and I call Fidelity, and there's, 150 different portfolio managers running 150 different funds and, trying to get them interested, if I wanted to talk about orbital sciences, I would call the defense analyst. If I wanted to call about Iridium, I'd call the telecom analyst. If I wanted to talk about digital globe, Earth observation, it's a special situations analyst. I could not, there was no space analyst on the other side. And that created a fundamental problem for me. If you're a restaurant analyst, you know who to call at every single one of these firms, not hard. And that doesn't exist. I would like to think it will in the future. And, having forecasts out there that investors can understand, they know what the numbers are going to be or what the forecasts look like for AI. Right. We all get in a tither about whether the industry is a trillion or 2 trillion. They probably never even saw that number, right?
Yeah.
So it is important to have those forecasts out there. And I'd say, like Kevin, my job as a financial analyst is not to come up with the 10-year forecast. I live in the world of the second derivative. What is the slope of the line going up or is it going down? What's going to cause it to go up or go down? When is it going to go up or go down? And why? That's the thing that people make money on. If everybody thinks it's a $1 trillion industry, if the whole world believed it was a $1 trillion industry, all in the efficient market theory, all of that would be priced into the stocks today. The stocks today believe, based upon that Morgan Stanley report, this is a $1 trillion industry, and this is what Iridium is worth today based on that. So we either need to make them really, really believe, and then the stocks go way up, or prove that it ain't going to happen and they go down.
Those are excellent points. And Tina, you've been brought up a couple of times, but give me a moment before I get to you. But Leslie, again, your report is really viewed as a baseline by so many in the media industry, government, and so forth. So be interested to get your take on how you deal with the definitions and the fact that there isn't common agreement, as George and Chris just referenced, to some fundamentals? How do you deal with that? And another related, if you will, topic is to what extent, really all of you who, well, outside Tina, who work for organizations that, if I can put it this way, have a vested interest in a positive view of the potential of the industry. How do you avoid having that influence your projections? But let me start with the definitional issues, how you grapple with that, Leslie.
So really one of the things that we do is, because we don't do a lot of forecasting, so what we're really trying to do is provide that good benchmark. So we look at, on the one side, the government budgets that are not only moved over through the commercial system, but are also truly an indicator of what a nation and its leadership is envisioning and planning, or how some nations are responding to the larger global environment. On a commercial side, we really look at key sectors, and we stay with some fairly established sectors. However, as space is evolving, we are looking at and acknowledging those, but does that factor in? That's part of that assessment, the kind of secret sauce maybe that you talk about. So some sectors, certainly such as ground stations and launch and satellite manufacturing, those are foundational sectors. What we need to look at and anticipate certainly are things like artificial intelligence. What will the effect be on that? There's also, I think it's fair to say that we tend to stick with certainly kind of first tier commercial activity. So we are looking at that direct effect. One of the things I like to point out is, for example, we don't really look at the secondary effect of, say, the pharmaceuticals that are developed courtesy of space station research. We don't factor in, for example, that as a direct result of developing the lenses for the James Webb Space Telescope, that improved imaging for LASIK surgery that then expanded that market. So that's one of the interesting things that those of us who really geek out on data can vigorously debate all day long. Could you argue that the next generation of LASIK surgery is a direct line to space? We don't go there yet. We stick with that foundational item.
Could I add to that, Leslie? To what extent do you take into account the Ubers and the Lyfts and so forth out there that use GPS, for example, ATM that uses GPS? To what extent are you, in fact, factoring in those collateral benefits, those contributions, non-trivial contributions to the
Oh,
to the
absolutely.
economy?
Because, position, navigation, and timing that informs so much of that. That is really one of the main market drivers. I don't know that anyone on this esteemed panel 20 years ago would have imagined that we would be tracking our Domino's pizza or our Amazon delivery on our cell phones, as we also sat in the living room, with Netflix and every other platform. So
Right.
There are a number of ways that we do look at that, and PNT is one.
So you do try to capture that, quantify that to some level.
To some level, yeah. Well,
Interesting.
and in terms of PNT, to a significant level.
And before leaving you, and I will ask a few others the same question, just the pressures, right? You work for the Space Foundation. It's a very pro commercial space, very positive in terms of the future of civil, commercial, and obviously national security space. How do you avoid the what I would presume to be sort of that dynamic to want to always push for a positive predictions, or not predictions, but the annual number that you put out?
Well, I think fortunately, both historically and currently, our leadership, from the board to the CEO, I do not feel any pressure. I don't think our team does. If anything, I think the pressure is to get it right. I think a lot of that is self-imposed. From the very beginning of the space report, the Space Foundation recognized and has emphasized that whatever data or publishing we do is from a nonpartisan aspect. And really it drives to, again, our primary function at the Space Foundation is to educate, to inform, and to collaborate. And I think there's agreement certainly that really nobody benefits if you're skewing numbers. First of all, it eventually, I think, catches up with you as more vigorous analysis is done by more and more groups. But within our organization, I would say there's really a good firewall of understanding that what we do is going to be as unbiased and as accurate as we can get it.
And again, before I get to you, Tina, just Kevin, I've got to ask you, when your former boss, Wilbur Ross, came out with that large number, were there pressures? Because after all, Commerce is really the one statutorily organization that is meant to advocate and champion for American industry. So did you feel any pressure to come out with a rosier prediction than otherwise might have been supported by the facts on the ground? Sorry, you're on mute.
Right. Sorry about that. As I'm sure Tina, Commerce doesn't generate well, at least we didn't at the time generate any of this kind of information. And so what we did early on, if I'm remembering the end of 2018 pretty well, we went up to New York, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, the others, and basically said, why are you publishing these numbers? What's in them? What are your assumptions? And so in 2018, calculating forward to 2030 or even 2040, if I'm remembering the number correctly, a modest growth rate every single year between 2018 and 2030 or 2040 gives you a pretty decent number, toward the $1 trillion number. There were also some assumptions about the lunar economy that were in there. And, what we're really saying, Courtney, here in this discussion is these are the early days. There's no agreement yet on what to count and how to count it. I've seen some good comments in the chat on this, actually. And like anything else in the research field, show your work if you're doing the research. And on the other hand, if you're the reader, be a critical reader of what the assumptions actually are. I can tell you my assumptions, I can tell you my data, you can disagree with both of them, but then you know how I got my number. And so it's critical that we all, as we're doing these things, actually show that info. So we did not feel pressure. In addition to the sort of pursuit of the banks in New York that were actually looking at these numbers, we had, you might recall, 3 summits with entrepreneurs, a couple of which filled the auditorium at Commerce. And we engaged people who were looking at the market critically. Again, some of the people on this call were involved in those meetings as well, to say, what are the boundaries around the growth rates here? What can fuel the growth and what can impede the growth? The only other thing I'd say is that to your concern about sort of positive pressure pushing these numbers upwards, when I look at the assessment of what's happened in the private finance world since the end of 21, the glorious end of 21, and where we are today, I think people are being pretty accurate in describing, I'll say, the roller coaster ride. It's even harsher than that. And so there are people that are actually trying to put forward accurate numbers on the things that are either encouraging or impeding the space economy.
Gotcha. Thank you. Now, Dr. Heifel, back to you. I thought I heard George make reference to, if I understood you correctly, George, that there's no formal coding for space per se as the discrete item. Is that correct? Okay. So Tina,
it doesn't have its own code, right? So you have to pull from other codes to build it.
So Tina, starting with that, if I may, is there a need for that, or do you feel that that given the classifications you're working with, that's sufficient, or is space mature enough to warrant its own code? Let's start with that, and then please feel free to comment on any of the comments you've heard so far.
Great, thank you. Yeah, George is right. There's not one single code to quantify space. So when we measure the economy, we have what are called industry codes or product codes. So there's about over 5,000 different categories of goods and services, and they all have their own specific code. And so when we come up with our statistics, the first step was to go through these list of codes, the list of products, and say, okay, is this a space product? And so I don't think there will ever be a space code because there's so many space products that exist in essentially every industry in the United States, and that was kind of one of the reasons that Kevin came to us to ask us to do this type of analysis. Because if you're just looking at standard macroeconomic statistics, you wouldn't be able to pull out space because it's within manufacturing, it's within construction, government, and things like that. And so I'll also make comments on something Chris said. Transparency, I think, is key. So I'm just delighted to hear that Chris reads our footnotes. I think that's amazing. Thank you, Chris. One thing, we realize that there's no one perfect definition. There never will be. What is space? What is the space economy? But we try to talk about methodology in very specific detail. We have the list of products that we include in our statistics on our website. And those products are actually being used by the European statistical agency Eurostat to come up with their own set of space economy statistics for different European countries. And so the advantage there is that we'll be able to compare the US space economy to the other countries that use that criteria. But with that said, I do think that there is an advantage to having multiple definitions as long as it's clear, because I don't think there's always going to be, there's ever going to be just one answer to all of that. Thank you.
Let me also add, I note that your analysis, the outcomes are run about roughly 2 years behind in terms of current year. I did ask you the other day about AI, and you did say that you're using that to some extent in your analysis. Do you anticipate speeding up that lag time a bit? And in addition, I understand you're trying to get a little more granularity as to states as well.
Yep, that's right. So we don't produce forecasts at BEA, we produce retrospective statistics. And so within the United States GDP, for example, we just released data through 2024 Q1. So we are a little bit lagged even within our US statistics. These special statistics that we do, it's not just the space economy, but things like the digital economy, the marine economy, and things like that. They tend to lag a little bit because we have to find additional data sets to isolate the activity we're looking at. And so a big part of the space economy is government spending. And it's not just Space Force, Air Force. There's a lot of agencies, federal and state and local, that are involved in space. And so we're looking at using AI to go through those budget documents to hopefully help us speed up kind of our analysis of that. That's still TBD. With AI, somebody still has to look at it to make sure it's making sense. But the main two improvements we're looking at is accelerating our data. So we're about at an 18-month lag now, and we're trying to get that down to at least 12-month lag. We'll see how that goes, and then also to produce statistics by state, which I think will make these statistics a lot more salient to our data users. They'd really like to know not just one number, here's the space economy, but how does my state contribute to the US space economy is also a really important thing we're looking into. But it's hard, getting data for the US global economy is hard. With states, it's even harder. So those are our two challenges coming up.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Yeah. I was just going to weigh in, and actually, this is the first time I met Tina. Like, I'm not making a plug, but on that topic of state level things, I mean, just to give people a sense of how bad our data is, I had a kid, like lots of kids reach out to me about space jobs. And he said, hey, I want to go to a non-tax state. I want to go to Florida or Texas, right? And so here I am. I'm a space analyst. I've been doing this 25 years, and surely I could shoot him over my list of Florida space companies. Not, right? So, and you know, I go to Florida and Texas, and I talk to authorities there, and I'm like, hey, do you have a list of space companies? Because the Google search didn't show it, right? And but I do know some companies, right? But I don't know what facilities are there. Is that just a satellite office, or are there real people there? And when I ended up talking to one of the states, and I said, look, you guys ought to have this information, like to help people with jobs and whatnot. The answer was, well, that would cost around $200,000. Then we'd have to spend that every year to keep the thing updated. And we don't want to do that. We don't have the budget for that. Like, that's where we're at, you know. You know, the other thing I wanted to comment on with regard to the forecasts is, because I'm a user in a lot of cases of forecasts, is look at the incentive system and you'll understand the answer, right? Which is to say, you know, if you're, you know, a financial analyst and you're creating a long-term forecast, what you're trying to do is do a very positive view of the industry, right? Because nobody's going to buy your stock or your sector if it's bad, right? There was a reason that they had to literally force Wall Street to have a certain percentage of sell ratings, because nobody wants to put a sell. You know, you put a sell on things and investors don't want to buy it and they don't want to trade your stocks. And, you know, why would you want to cover a sell? So you just pick up companies that are sells just so you have your predetermined number of sells, right? Okay. I'm getting a little bit in the weeds.
No, but that's the real world. So thank you for that.
Oh yeah, it is. Stay away from cells. But, you know, I guess the point is, the incentive system will drive how people develop the forecasts. And here's a real world example. So we had a whole wave of companies come public in SPAC transactions. And just for the heck of it, I said, okay, we've got, you know, 4 different companies in the Earth observation market. And okay, I won't say the names. One sized the industry at $40 billion, a second one at $70 billion, and the third one at $110 billion. If I go to the Satellite Industry Association, which is, I think Bryce does those numbers, it's 3.2 billion. Okay.
A little bit of a delta. Yeah.
There's a little bit of a delta. And, you know, this whole GPS thing, like if General Motors tried to say our TAM, you know, our total addressable market for the automotive market is, well, it involves all these companies that build road building equipment and build roads and the restaurants and the hotels associated with it. It's like, no, that's BS. The GPS industry for the space industry is 2 things. It's Lockheed and Boeing and OHB and Airbus building satellites, and it's guys building the ground equipment. Period. End of story. That's it. That's the revenues.
And this is something.
Go ahead, George.
Oh, sorry. We look at the motivations too, it's also to understand, and I'll say, you know, where we come from, right? So if we're engaged with a company, or if we're investing into a company, and they're looking to put together their pro formas, they're looking to put together their 4 and 5 year projections. They're not a public company, right? They're doing their best estimates to understand, okay, additive manufacturing as it applies to these new types of satellites will be worth what, right? This new PPU I have that's going to go fly, what's that worth, right? How big is that market for this application for a satellite? And so again, what they're trying to forecast is oftentimes completely removed from industry-wide numbers, right? They want to understand very narrowly, okay, what am I aiming at? And is it big enough to aim at for the investment I need to put in, right? So it really does depend on, are you talking to someone who has, you know, public shares and stockholder meetings, or are you talking to someone who has a pro forma and has to meet with their angel investors to make it to the next round and to see if this investment is worth their time, money, and efforts.
That's a profoundly important point. Kevin, do you want to make any comments?
No, I think the comments here are spot on. The extent to which, you know, people are trying to improve the data, you know, we're still in the very early days of this. You know, somebody mentioned the top line number. at the end of the day, the number itself is not as important as the trend lines that belie it. And I think, over time, we also need to start to do a much better job in the different market segments, whether they be the existing ones, which are themselves changing at lightning speed, or the newer ones that, we're just barely starting to think about from a technical perspective. I'll make a comment. George was talking a little bit about investment, and one of the pathologies I see in the space community is that mostly entrepreneurs get so excited about their technology that in the course of an investment call, they can actually put the investor from hot to cold because they want to talk so much about the technology and they don't talk about the customers. And what investors want to hear about is the customers. And so telling him the next nth detail on how I turned this screw on the side of the satellite, actually, so the investor typically says, oh, I thought I understood this, but I actually don't. And so I better back away at this point. And so, we have our own uniqueness in the on the ground aspects of investing as well here. We have to work through.
Yeah, and if I could add to that from my own personal experience in capital raises, you can sometimes I've seen in pitches where there's a reference made to some of these high forecast numbers, and the investor is not always particularly taken by it. It goes back to what you, George, and others were saying. It's what problem are you trying to solve out there in the market? It's nice to know that the macro view is as rosy as you claim, but I think sometimes you're right, Kevin. You have to be very careful, as been mentioned, how you use these numbers.
Yeah, I've literally had companies come to me and say, Chris, we developed this product. Can you help us figure out what the market for it is? And I'm like, oh, my wife just texted me the house is on fire. I gotta go. Sorry. It happens.
Yeah. I'll pretend I never had that experience. I want to compliment the audience for stepping up. So we have some really terrific
If I can pull
questions.
on one of the threads that's in the chat from the audience,
Yeah, please do that.
There's this conversation about value, and I took it to mean, I put on my philosopher hat. I have no business wearing that hat, by the way. I put on my philosopher hat. I was like, well, what is the value, right? But that's
the dunce cap.
Well, it is a dunce cap. I have one nearby. But seriously, here we go. Here, I put my smartphone. That's the dunce cap, right? But seriously, we have these conversations about, what's the impact on GDP, but a lot of times we're not talking about the multiplying effect.
Right.
And that's separate from these forecasts, right? So when you talk about the multiplying effect, and one of the things we were talking about in the chat was, NASA's impact on amino acids in baby food, right? That's one of the best ones you can cite to about NASA never set out to improve baby food, but it did, right? And then how do you measure the impact of not delaying brain development for babies that don't have access to breast milk? Right. I can't quantify that. I'm not that good of an economist, right? But there is a value there that's being transferred to society. And sometimes when we're getting wrapped around ourselves with, I don't like George's 4 trillion number, or I don't like so-and-so's 500 million number, whatever it is, we also have that conversation, especially when we're outside of our space nerd friends, about the rest of these values, right? Not the economics all the time, but the rest of these values, because I think it's lost, right? Outside of these friendly groups, I think it's lost.
And I think that's another important point, is that yes, forecasts, specifically slope lines, all of that really goes to an investor market. But one of the things we also have to recognize is that outside of the space enthusiast, most of the world, most of America can't even understand that their cell phone is connected to a satellite. They just don't see the overall effect and value of the space economy. So even in, large number, broad explanation, having that, constantly looked at, even having, some of the higher end forecasts, it still goes to kind of the aspirational nature of space, and it becomes a great topic line. I think the thing that has to happen is when that buzz is created from the big number, we have to continue to capitalize and explain on that so that we can continue to grow a larger audience of people who will support and invest in space.
And the way you seem to deal with it at the foundation and the space report, I note, is you have sections that get to the so-called indirect benefits, right, to the economy. And you may speak anecdotally, right, Leslie, to how society benefits from these various effects. Yeah. Stan Schul, hope I have the name pronounced correctly, has an interesting observation, and he talks about how common estimates for current size of global space economy include a lot of things people, going back to your point, Leslie, would not normally consider part of the space sector. He threw in GPS, chipset, satellite direct to home, and so forth. And he noted that IDA, Institute for Defense Analysis, did a study a few years back that, in his view, a little more realistic, came up with about half the number, and then half of what esteemed groups like the Bryce Tech group that puts out its own marketing analyses, National Space Foundation or Space, not sure what the Space Foundation is, Society maybe. Anyway, as he said, nothing wrong with these large numbers, but most people who cite them have no idea what's included. Can the panelists speak to providing more transparency about what's in and what's not in the current size estimates? And we've sort of alluded to that, but this suggests that maybe we should get a little more fidelity. So
Yeah.
I'm
Go
more
ahead,
than
George.
happy to pick on my own number because I know it's one of the larger ones.
That'd be great.
Right? So
Thank you.
So 4 trillion 2040. So the reason that number is larger than most is because it makes assumptions. And this is a number that you might have seen in either Gerritson's book or Colucci's book. It cites back to the Milky Way economy number. And the reason it's bigger is because we have assumptions about there being 8 to 12 space stations. And just that assumption alone changes the rest of the math, right? So if you don't believe that there'll be 8 to 12 space stations and the necessary infrastructure to support that, then you shouldn't use my number. Okay, that is a big differentiating factor. Another part of my number is I don't see space tourism or private space exploration, trying to be nice to my friend Rick, as a huge market. Then that's also in my number, right? I don't have that as being a huge input. Okay, so with those two differences of assumptions, when you're going out to a number that's 20 years from now, it results in huge differences later on. Okay, so just to be clear, you could do the same thing with everyone else's number, right? Whether it's World Economic Forum or whoever, they make certain assumptions about what the activity will look like down the road, and then that backs them into what activities are going to be happening. So that's where you see the big differences.
Got it. Anybody else want to?
I'll jump in. So, again, I'll go back to, what is the motivation of the person doing the report, right? So when a lot of these brokerage firms write reports on SpaceX, they're out to 2040 and there's 200 million cars connected and, spaceships flying around and whatnot. And you get to the valuation to justify where it's trading and whatever. And the assumptions are just off the charts crazy. When we've done work, we kind of do the opposite. We just did. I mean, everybody's done a report on SpaceX Starlink, right? But we counted up the number of ground stations, estimated the fiber backhaul, counted up the number of employees, the salary by state, the cost of the launch, and kind of came to an honest look at what this thing costs. Like, we didn't model out past 2024. We'll stretch it out, but you have to actually start with the ground numbers. And so we had an issue where people were asking us, how many satellites are going to be launched in the future? And so we took the 400 constellations and we found every single government program. And then we took this massive list. And then we said, okay, throw out the Russians, throw out the Chinese. And now we got this. Now, what if this is real? And so you have to come up with a system that can validate which is real and which isn't, right? So, okay, how much money have they made? How many employees do they have? Do they have heritage, on orbit? Have they selected a prime contractor, right? And you literally probability weight every single one of these constellations. And then you take the reality factor. So, a company like eSpace, right? Greg Weiler's company came out and said it was going to launch 100,000 satellites. Do I put that in my model? Like that makes, a company like Hawkeye 360 that's raised hundreds of millions of dollars and they're trying to build 30 satellites. If I put eSpace into the forecast, like Hawkeye, which is real, gets washed out by this thing that turned out to not be real, right? So it's a combination of trying to do things with rigorous, numbers and statistics. But at the end of the day, you're going to be dependent on some analyst, whether it's me or somebody else to layer on the reality factor. And, give you an example of that, we were helping a company raise capital and I put on my analyst hat and I kind of cut the markets and the competition and I kind of drew out this thing and I said, look, this is a $2 billion market. And the investor who I was working with said, Chris, I love this story, but I need a $20 billion TAM, not two. And I said, but it isn't. Like this, I thought the argument was he was going to fight with me over the 2 billion TAM. He's like, no, I need a 20 billion TAM. And the reason he needs a 20 billion TAM is because he's going into pitch against other PMs that have ideas. And this guy's got a 50 billion TAM. If he walks in with a 2 billion TAM, nobody wants to hear the story, right? Even if it's real. And that one's total BS.
How did you react?
I came up with a 20 billion TAM.
Okay. Tina, a great friend of our community, Brian Whedon from Aerospace, asked, do the statistics suggest the major differences between the space sector and all the other sectors you also measure? Can you talk to that, please?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So the latest data we have for 2022 showed that the space economy actually grew faster than the overall US economy in terms of real GDP. Real means that we removed the impact of inflation, which, by the way, I think is one of the major advantages of our statistics is that we can control for inflation. But that's pretty atypical for the time series we have. We've seen in the past 5 years that the space economy had been growing slower than the overall US economy, largely due to the decline in satellite television. So, as broadband kind of proliferated and people in rural areas were able to stream video services using other means. And, so we saw shrinkage there. And then we also saw within manufacturing output basically staying pretty flat. And that I think surprised some people. So, and that's actually, I think, a good story because what's happening is that it's actually getting cheaper to produce things. And so, if you're able to produce things cheaper, prices go down. You think about the cost of products that include GPS and PNT equipment. It's a lot cheaper now than it used to be. But this year, the 2022, I was really delighted to see that, it makes my job easier when I can say that the space economy is growing faster than the US economy. A lot of that is due to two things. One is defense spending, so Space Force and R&D, and both government and private. So we saw double-digit growth in both government defense spending and R&D. So it really depends on the year, but I think this current year I think is very positive for the space economy.
And I should just add to that another question from Muriel Borowitz. She says, for you, Tina, does the estimate make distinctions between government and private spending, and how are commercial sales to the governments included?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think Kevin originally wanted a commercial space economy satellite account. Yeah. And I think that's what everybody wanted. And when we started to do our initial research, what we determined was that it was just really too hard to disentangle government with private with the way that our data are presented. And so if you look at our data, we have a top line number, of course, but then we also have it split out by industry. Government is an industry in the US economy, and that reflects production by government employees, so NASA, JPL, et cetera. Government spending shows up in private industry as well. So when Space Force, pays SpaceX or something, ULA for a launch, that production is done by a private company, so it shows up within the private industry that produces that product. So in other words, you can't look at our statistics and know total government spending, but you can see how much the government produces. And this year it was about the total space economy statistic for GDP was about 25%, just under 25% was government production. So government spending would be a bigger part of that. So hopefully I
I'm
answered
glad
that
you
question.
asked, because that was one of the questions in the
Yeah.
audience. What percentage is the government spending? Anyone else have any other perspectives?
Yeah, Tina was getting me all excited with that talk about numbers.
Just going through the list, and I have to defer to our Commander-in-Chief, Steve Wolf. Of course, Beyond Earth Institute is all about the human space flight and the ultimate future of human space community. So he was
and actually,
can
I jump in?
Yeah, please, Chris.
I do have a point on that. I think there is a difference in these forecasts, right, between what I explained, right, of trying to do a forecast of the number of satellites that will be built over the next 10 years. And we built this really rigorous forecast and we have a methodology around it. It's wrong, right? I couldn't pick a quarter right, a quarter ahead. It's wrong, but there's at least analysis around it. And the reality is, when we created it, it was based on the 400 constellations that we knew about. And we were eliminating the ones we thought were total garbage. But what we didn't know was the ones that were yet to be announced. Or here's the question. When we built the model, when we had SpaceX, did you put in 4,500 satellites or 7,500 or 15,000 or 30,000?
Yeah.
These are all real tough. Now, all of this is on the margin. We can argue about these things. The ones that are really tough, right, are the ones where you're sizing a market that doesn't exist today. So how big will asteroid mining be in 20 years? And what you I guess what you said, Courtney, when you were talking about human spaceflight, I remember there was a report, the predecessor to Bryce wrote for NASA, and it was a human spaceflight forecast. And these aren't the exact numbers, but it was like the number of private astronauts that will be launched in the next 10 years will be between 10 and 1,200. And I was like, they're right. Right. You know, and this is the thing, right? I mean, you're in the 1990s when it wasn't AI, right? It was fiber. Like they so overbuilt fiber that, 99% of it was dark.
Right.
And they were right about the thesis. They were just wrong on the timing. Eventually, all that fiber filled up. Every crazy thing, we're all old enough, except Tina, that we remember in the 1990s, they were talking about, oh, the internet's going to do this and the internet's going to do that. And then the internet bubble crashes and people like the internet sucks. But the reality was they weren't even close. Like they didn't even get close to thinking of the way that we use the internet today. They were just off on timescale.
Yeah.
So Elon Musk is always off on timescale. But I think a lot of the stuff that he's predicting is going to happen. Now, how big are those markets going to be? How big is asteroid mining? Who wants to be the first person, to come out with a 10-year forecast for asteroid mining? And everybody will laugh at it. There's a reason I don't read any of my past research, because I don't want to be reminded of my forecasts. So kudos to those guys that actually publish, like, here was our last year forecast, and here's this year's forecast, and this is what we forecast 5 years ago. Kudos, right?
I should say that I'm taken aback sometimes when I see the precision. It's not 2.5 or not 3, it's 2.7. It reminds me when I was at NASA, the 5-year out projections of new programs would be down to like 3-4 decimal points. I said, well, yeah, you have quite a crystal ball. You're an R&D agency, and you're telling us that it's going to be 6 point whatever, 8.9, billion rather than 7 billion or 6 billion anyway.
If I could build on something that Tina said that I think
please
kind of responds to this as well. and she mentioned how it's great for it's great for her job when she's talking to decision makers about how the growth rate in space for the space industry has been greater than the growth rate of the overall economy. That only has to happen for so long before you see some really meaningful changes, right?
Yeah.
So if the overall economy continues to grow at 2 or 3% and chugs along, right? Let's keep on hoping it goes this way, right? Keeps on chugging along at 2 or 3% year after year. It takes decades for an economy to double, right? For the overall size of an economy to double. If you have an industry like space where you might be growing at closer to 7, 10, maybe 12%, you can double in size in as little as 6 years, right? And so when there's a difference in growth rate, that matters a lot over longer periods of time, whether that be 5 years for pro formas or 10 years or 20 years for, wild people forecasts.
And I think it's important whether one has drunk the proverbial Kool-Aid or you're a skeptic. The fact is that Space Report is talking somewhat north of $500 billion this year. So to your point, George, extrapolating that out for the next X number of years, half decade plus, to get that to $1 trillion is not that big a stretch. And I think the global economy itself is what, George, or anybody on the panel, is roughly what today?
110 trillion.
With a prediction that, to your point, that over the next, 30, 40 years, it might close to double? Sorry, you're on mute again.
$1 in the jar for me too. Now all those side DMs don't make any sense. So right. So if you're growing at a 2 or 3% rate, it's going to take you 3 decades to double in size. Okay. So the global economy can get to 200 trillion 30 years from now, right? If 30 years from now, the space economy continues to grow at 8, 10, 12%, then you have a situation where it hasn't just doubled in size in those 30 years, it's quintupled, or however you say, times by 10.
Gotcha. Well, I got you on camera, George. I noticed Raja had asked, and you did respond in the chat, but let me put it out there for generally. You made reference that you've discounted on space tourism, and he said, well, with the pending number of space stations, if not space tourism, what do you foresee in terms of use, military manufacturing? What could you spend just a minute on that?
Sure. So it's life science, right? The first little purple pill or little blue pill that comes out of space research is going to be the killer app of space. If you are Merck and you're the one who comes up with that new crystal structure, that new biotech breakthrough that has to be, that all of us have to have, right, to lose those extra 10 pounds, right? If that comes out of space research, then that's going to be a really awkward board meeting for Pfizer or GlaxoSmithKline because they don't have that in their program, right? Like there's great examples. Every time you look at the payload manifest, you can see people like, Rhodium and others that are bringing up their biotech and their life science things for technology and testing all the time. We're not paying enough attention to that, but that's going to be what breaks through. And they start demanding rental space on space stations, right? It's going to be industrial parks, right? It's going to be industrial parks 200 miles that way.
Yeah.
And they will be the anchor tenants. I'm excited about space manufacturing. I think there is a place for citizen astronauts. I think that's all great, right? But I think in terms of where is there supply and demand pull and push, it has to be someone who needs to be there for the research or who needs to be there to get the types of, crystal structure or organ experimentation that you can only do up there. Yeah. Right. One of the big things in medicine and chemicals, especially for additives, is the 4 nines problem. Right. So we do a really good job getting to 3 nines of purity here on Earth. 4 nines is super hard. You know where 4 nines is really easy? Up there. And so those types of things will create demand signals. All of a sudden, everyone who wants to have their own commercial space station, you start having willing buyers, willing renters from life science companies, again, big pharma, big biotech. That changes everything. And we get to 8 to 12 really quick. It's also 8 to 12 because probably 4 of them are Chinese. So I'm just going to say that out there so everyone knows how I feel. But it'll be 8 to 12.
So Courtney, just link the last 2 themes we've talked about. On the one hand, looking at better than average rates of growth, and now bring in the general case of what George is talking about, I've got a pharmaceuticals industry that's engaged. You know, the space industry did a great job talking to itself for 6 decades. Now we really have the attention of the agriculture community, pharmaceuticals, mining, you pick it. And that's going to be responsible for another whole wave of innovation that will easily lead us to those better than average growth rates that Tina has been talking about.
You're right. It's been the holy grail, right, of our industry to reach out, bridge into the other non-space, or what our friend Scott Pace calls the space ghetto that we often find.
Ghetto, right.
So your point is really well taken.
Yeah.
Leslie, Leslie, you want to make a point, and I have a question for you.
Okay, well, a couple of things really quickly. So yes, it is the pharmaceutical research, but it's also, you know, I don't know how many people know that there's a Downy laundry product that was developed on the space station, that, you know, Ferrari has sent paint chips into space to test, you know, the solar effect and the endurance of the longevity of their product. So yes, it's that. And there are, you know, we're on a limited platform right now. China's space station, they have, I believe, 1,000 contracts waiting to go up and do microgravity research. I think on the other end of the spectrum, though, one of the things we've been talking about as we look at economic growth is that either unexpected disruptor, such as COVID, or even as the US stays focused on what they see as their development plan with the Artemis program, as other nations are beginning to recognize the value of space and invest heavily. We're in our analysis this year, we're seeing that France and Italy and Japan and South Korea are making, you know, 37 to 50% increases in their spending because of the potential that they see. And so that's kind of the uncertainty, but also the potential aha explosion of the potential of what space can bring to the larger community.
And just to add to that, China just had this momentous return mission from the moon this past week, and they've made no secret of their focusing on both water and obviously so-called rare earth minerals on the moon, in terms of turning that into a profitable extraction industry. So so it is on the race, as it were. Leslie, a question again from our friend Stan about double accounting in space economy size estimates. And he goes on to say his understanding is that each subsector is a full quote unquote size estimate, and these are added up without eliminating overlaps. So for instance, launch revenue is included in the launch sector, but launch costs are not subtracted in the satellite sector. I guess the point is that it can get pretty messy pretty fast. Do you and the team try to segregate that out, make an effort to at least minimize the so-called double accounting?
Yes, we do look at that. We do recognize that there is some overlapping, but as we re-examine our methodology, we also do try to look at what is kind of the cleanest way that we can not only get the data, but have an expectation that that data will continue to be available, and that it will allow us to look back as well so that we can better examine the trend analysis.
Go ahead. Do you have something else you want to add?
Well, I don't want to skew the conversation too much, but Lori Cole, I believe, had a question about, you know, really trying to look at the growth potential of, you know, the lunar economy. That certainly is a driver of conversation. There's a lot of expectation. So again, part of that balance or analysis is certainly what happens on Earth from a geopolitical situation could change priorities. But on the other hand, when you see what China is doing, when you see what India and UAE have committed to, as that becomes public, that again is an endorsement and a driver for other nations to continue to invest.
Right.
Courtney, can I weigh in?
Please, I was going to point to you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe just to step back for a second on this issue of growth, right? Let's level set. What is growth? Growth is GDP. End of the day, right? GDP grows at, let's just pick a number, 3%, right? China used to grow at 15%, and then it came down to low teens, and now they're growing at 8%. And when they're a mature economy, they'll grow at 3%, right? And you get spurts where you go faster and slower. But when you look at the economy and the economic sectors, investors generally want to be in those that are growing faster than GDP, and you want to minimize the ones that are below GDP. You know, you look at our industry and you can say, you know what, I think direct-to-home TV, you know, as a industry is going away. That's been the trend, right? It's been down for 5-6 straight years, declining 5 to 7% a year as contracts roll off. And that's a sub-GDP market. Private equity guys want to own it because they can milk it for cash and lever it up and whatnot. There's useful, these are still useful assets, right? I used to hate the restaurant analyst. You know, I mean, like, what the hell does the guy talk about other than, you know, the new burger that was introduced and the weather and the cost of cheese? Like the weather, the restaurant industry is pretty, I mean, you would say this is a GDP industry. But what was his pitch? His pitch was, hey, you know, from 1990 through 2050, the percent of the household that, you know, eats out is going to go from, you know, 5% to 40%. And hence my industry is going to grow at 4%. And we're a growth industry because we're growing faster than GDP, right? This is how investors think about where to deploy capital. So when you think about our industry, and I'll give you a subset of this, probably the most high profile thing going on in the industry, if you ask your friends and family, they talk about SpaceX, right? Either in the launch or Starlink, right? Starlink. Well, at the end of the day, they said they're going to spend $10 billion. Amazon said they'll spend at least 10 billion. They spent 10 billion on the launch alone. Okay. You've got Telesat, you've got Rivada, you've got OneWeb, these guys are plowing tens of billions into the industry. Anybody know how big, according to SIA, the SATCOM industry is? Wholesale SATCOM revenues. It's like 25 billion, right? So if that was their market, like serving the like we're just going to eat their lunch and we're going to take over the traditional geo business, it wouldn't work. Like for their business model to work, they need to grow the pie. And you've seen that with SpaceX, 90% of their subs are consumers, right? Here domestically and internationally, whether it's, you know, me $120 or $35 in Nigeria, you know, they're selling, and every single one of those subscribers, not every single one, are incremental, right? There were only 2 companies in the world of size, Hughes and Viasat, that were selling consumer broadband services. Now their subs are down 30%, but that's a fraction of what SpaceX has done. SpaceX has created new markets. And in fact, I would tell you their business model is really only going to work if they do something that no space company has ever done, which is compete directly with terrestrial and, you know, go into that $1 trillion market and say, look, long haul fiber backhaul, we're going after that, you know, $100 billion market.
Right.
We're going to eat it.
All
right?
bets are off. Yeah.
Right. And likewise, you know, we were talking about human space flight or lunar or in space manufacturing. Like these are new markets. Like if we can make these markets work, we're growing faster than GDP, right? This is a growth industry. And you know, neat trick. I had an investor the other day who said like, well, you know, and remember, most investors, if you're a portfolio manager running a small cap growth fund, you got 300 stocks in your portfolio representing 27 economic sectors. And if you happen to have one space company, you're like, what the hell is this? I inherited it from the old portfolio manager. What do I do with it? Right. And so the investor saying to me is like, why should I care about space? And I started to go into my normal rote explanation, which is, you know, the cost of launch was the barrier. Now that the cost of launch is down, you can economically, I can run a spreadsheet and say, yeah, you can make money commercially mining an asteroid that you couldn't do before, right? And you're seeing that.
Yeah.
It took 55 years to get to 1,000 satellites on orbit, and SpaceX is launching 2,000 a year, right? So the market is growing because of these sort of economic changes. All that said, he's like, okay, that's kind of interesting. And then my punchline was, I said, okay, wait a second. How about this? The world's two richest people, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, are not simply investing in space companies or investing in the space industry. These are two people that said they want to spend their personal wealth to make the world humankind a multiplanetary species, Elon Musk, or Jeff Bezos, millions of people living and working in space. So that's a pretty good tailwind. Maybe that's another half point on our plus GDP growth rate, right?
Right.
Chris, thank you for that. I'm glad you expanded on that. Those are excellent points. We're at 2:26, and I want to just spend 1 minute on a question from Aaron Boyson, and then on my Black Swan question, and then we'll shift the microphone back to Steve Wolf. For the audience, Aaron's asking, what data set sources, either publicly available or free, does the panel respect more than others, or I should say you would refer the public at large to? Kevin, do you have any in particular that put you on the spot for a second that you might?
I think that, there's a handful. I mean, the Space Foundation, the Euroconsult, there's not that many of them at this point. You can't actually read all of them and do your own assessment. Pay attention to the capital, pay attention to the reports about the private capital going into the industry, pay attention to the reports that talk about the government investments in space, including the sovereign wealth funds, where we're seeing a lot of interest in even countries that are not in space doing that. So
excellent.
My cheap answer here is read them all and understand the assumptions being made in them, and then figure out from your own perspective where you think this is all going. I think this discussion we just had about growth, this comment, about moving faster than national GDP, I think that's very, very important and relatively simple to think through.
Thank you. Unless anybody has a quick response, I want to get into my my last comment and then turn it over to Steve, which is the Black Swan. Given everything you all know about the industry, its trends, its challenges, I'd like to hear your personal view on what the future permanent space communities might hold. And George, you've already alluded to it, but what potential major industries might be the key drivers, let's say within the next 50 years? And who among the nations do you anticipate would be the main players by that time? And Tina, I understand if you want to stay away from this, but you're more than welcome to offer your perspective. Let me start, well, as I see you arrayed on the screen here, let me start with Kevin.
So I think you're going to see an extraordinary amount of research in space. Again, I don't know that I'd go with 8 to 12 commercial space stations, but I think we will have sufficient demand for a lot. And the starting point here is that if you're a Nobel Prize winning scientist or a high school kid in McLean, you're sold out on the space station. It's very hard to get new research done. There's a lot of demand for research on the space station, the microgravity environment. So I don't know if that's a sector, but certainly we've talked about all the ones: mining, pharmaceuticals, agriculture. There's a food in space community that's growing in Japan. There are 24, 25 companies focused on food and space. What I like to say about that is when we went to the moon for 5 days, you could put up with about anything, but if you go permanently and sustainably, as we're all committed to doing, or most of us are committed to doing, you're going to have some of the creature comforts of home. So I think those are going to be some of the drivers in the next handful of years for what we'll see going on in space.
Thank you. And if the audience will forgive me and the panelists, we may bleed past 2:30 for a couple of minutes if you all don't mind, and give Steve a chance to wrap up. I must say that I was on the phone with the CEO of Flawless Photonics the other day, and he's claiming that they're beginning to make money from fiber, boutique specialized fiber that's being made in space. So, and we're huge fans at BE of Rhodium Scientific, I might add, that great supporters. Chris, your view. You're on mute again. Sorry.
Sorry, yeah, but back to the Yogi Berra quote, like it's, I mean, especially when you ask the question of like, who will be the players? I used to remember there was a statistic back to the stock market. If you looked at the Dow Jones Industrial Average, right? And in 1950, the average company in the Dow had been on the Dow for 20 years. But by the 1980s, the average company had been on for 15 years. And by the year 2000, they had been on 12 years, and now they're on 7 years, right? It took electricity 46 years to reach 25% of the population. It took VCRs 34 years. Internet took 7, right? So technology is accelerating, and trying to guess who the winners are going to be in the future is really a challenging game. I mean, you can bet on the market, but betting on the individual company is always a tough one, unless, and the caveat here is, that company happens to be a monopoly. So like, why is it like you would have used Microsoft in that example in the 1990s because they're the operating system, and guess what? They're still here, in the kind of, the FANG stocks. It's not FANG anymore, but because they have this monopoly on the desktop system that, the regulators gave up trying to get away from them. You could say maybe the same with a Google, right? Because they own search. Maybe that's the thing, that when you get that viral scale that nobody else can get, unless search engines go away and everything becomes talking to your phone because AI does it. But what I'm saying is it's really, really hard for any company to hold on to a particular domain. So there was a time when Cisco looked like it was going to dominate the world, and now most people under 30 have never heard of the company, right? So SpaceX is front and center now, and I wish them well because they're doing good things for the industry and for the world. But who am I to say, right? Somebody doesn't come up with a warp drive engine that makes everything that they did irrelevant.
Very sobering way to look at it. Leslie?
I wasn't going to use this reference, but since Chris brought up VCRs, I think one of the things we all have to acknowledge is that for, every VHS success, there's probably going to be a few Betamaxes out there as well. So those of you who are under 40, you can Google that and understand why those of us are laughing who know this. So yes, I mean, that is the market uncertainty, but I think you also have, in terms of space, a couple of things. One, investing in space sounds a lot cooler than saying you're putting your money in the next Chuck E. Cheese or Taco Bell. So I think there's a certain cachet to that helps. And then, of course, just the success of seeing SpaceX, that does fuel the imagination. In terms of, what next, I agree. I think the economies of scale with not only research in microgravity, but the production of fiber, it's all really, as much as we try to say we know where it's headed, again, as Chris points out, I don't know that if you have us on 10 years later, any of us are going to be right or are going to be able to say, I called that new product 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Do me a favor, Aaron said he was asking not so much on the data set sources, but just he was asking not for the analysis, but on data sets. So if anybody sees that in chat, it can help Aaron. I'd appreciate that. Professor Pullen?
Sure. So I'm going to refer to something that General Shaw refers to as the third space age. I call it the fifth industrial revolution. Other people call it different things. The reason that he talks about the third space age and I talk about the fifth industrial revolution as the space economy is because of, just like Leslie's talking about, what's going to be happening in the next 10 years is what we shall be preparing for, but we have to prepare for an uncertain future. And so as we're preparing for that uncertain future, that's the point of our debate about, what numbers do we include in our forecast? Which ones do we not, right? Why do we all look back at, Tina's estimates where she brings out the hard data, or Leslie's, and say, okay, what is the difference in these two telling me, and how does that change my outlook going 10 or 15 or 20 years out, right? When I pull out my crystal ball, or Kevin pulls out his or Chris's. And so the reason that's important is we have to be humble enough to know that we don't fully understand that next industrial revolution. I think Chris's point on time scales is also spot on. Chris, you owe me one for that one. I think Chris's on timescales is spot on. It is compressing faster than we realize. And that means that by the time we understand that we're all then a part of the space economy, just like we're all now part of the internet economy. Hello, everyone, we're on Zoom, right? Once you realize that, it's already too late, right? The giant movement has already happened, and now you're just catching up with the trend.
Gotcha.
And so I think for winners, one of the places that we haven't talked about where there'll probably be big winners is internationally, because this next space race is something I say often is going to be a relay race, right? This isn't about us versus the USSR, right? Just to wake up, everyone, USSR is long gone. They're not around anymore, right? We already won that one. This next space race is going to be when we're bringing in allies, and our adversaries are also bringing in their allies. And we're all going to try to get there in larger groups and together. So when you see interesting companies and interesting space technology coming up places like Argentina, Brazil, Israel, Ukraine, Hungary, you should be paying attention to those, right? Because they're all going to pick a partner and come along as well. And
Gotcha.
so I think that's a big trend that we maybe didn't talk about during this call, but I think it's important for us to keep in mind.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Tina, I will say to Aaron that his tax dollars are helping to pay for your data set. So he certainly has one major link that he should be accessing. Tina, any closing observations?
Well, I'm not allowed to have personal opinions at work, so but I appreciate that you allowed me on this panel. I think it went really well. Thank you.
Absolutely invaluable having you, and I can't thank you all enough. And I think, frankly, as a space community, we are enormously grateful and lucky to have every one of you contributing your expertise and skill to our still very nascent, fledgling, evolving community. And everybody out there, before I turn it to Steve, remember, when you read these reports, to Chris's point, read the footnotes. Read the footnotes. All right. Thank you all for your time. And back to our president, Steve Wolf.
Thanks, everybody.
Hey, thanks, Courtney, and thanks to the panel. This really has been a tremendous session. I've learned a lot just listening, and the excitement, enthusiasm, and it really is exciting, Courtney. Masterful moderation on your part once again. I just can't help thinking that as that all of this activity that and attention to the markets and the growth and the potential growth of the space market. Courtney, you could stay on the camera for a second. I'd like you to stay on here, but that this just the attention that's putting on the sector is going to help with the overall growth of this sector, because it's educating investors, it's educating consumers and so forth, that is going to have a compounding effect as we go forward. And I imagine your panelists agree with that a comment.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do. But thanks again, Courtney. And I just want to add a couple of things. Our audience has been great, and I really appreciate folks sticking around for a few more minutes.
Yeah, thank you.
We have a sponsorship line on the registration form, and I'm always really I feel satisfied that so many people choose to make a donation for these webinars, and it helps to keep us driving us forward. And I want to recognize that this trend of folks are adding more than $30. So we've had 2 people that have given even more than that amount just to participate. And I think it's a recognition of the kind of quality that we're producing, Courtney, with these kinds of programs. And I do want to, reiterate that the registration for the in-person fall Beyond Earth Symposium is open. We will be at the American University on November 12th and 13th. Please do go to our website, beyondearth.org, and check it out and get yourself registered. We want to see you there. So with that, I want to thank everyone again for being with us. and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you all.